How does a man whose only job is to taste another king's wine end up ruling the first empire the world has ever seen? 4,300 years ago, in the land between two rivers, one servant did exactly that. He built something no one on earth had ever built before. And then it fell so completely that the capital of the first empire in history has never been found. This is how the first empire rose, and how the world learned for the first time that an empire can fall. To understand the first empire, begin with the first cities. Here, in the south of what is now Iraq, a people called the Sumerians drained the marshes and raised the first true cities on earth: Uruk, Kish, Lagash. Cities of tens of thousands, ringed by walls, fed by canals, ruled from temples that climbed out of the flat plain like man-made mountains. They invented writing here, pressing wedge-shaped marks into wet clay. They gave the world the wheel, the plough, and the 60 minutes still counted in every hour. But for everything the Sumerians built, there was one thing they could never do. They could not stop fighting each other. Every city was its own kingdom, with its own king and its own god, and each was certain the others belonged to it. For centuries, the south bled itself pale in wars between neighbors. The Sumerians believed their world had been handed to them by gods they called the Anunnaki, and there are people today who still insist those gods were something stranger than a story. The truth is stranger. The first name history actually records here belongs to no god at all. It belongs to a foundling pulled from a river. The legend of his birth was written down long after he was gone, and it should sound familiar. A child, born to a priestess who could not keep him, sealed in a basket of reeds and set adrift on the Euphrates. A gardener named Aki lifted him from the water and raised him as a son. 1,000 years before the same tale was told of Moses, it was told of him. He climbed through the court of Kish, one of the great cities of the north, until he held a position of real trust. He became the king's cupbearer. The man who tasted the wine before his master drank it, close enough to the throne to guard a king's life. Close enough when the moment came to take it. Exactly how, no one knows. The records fall silent, the way records do around the death of a king. When they speak again, the cupbearer is gone, and in his place stands a ruler who has given himself a new name, Sharu-kin. It means the true king. It was a lie. He had no royal blood, no claim, no right to the throne he was sitting on. And he would spend the rest of his life making that lie come true. Sargon did something no king in the south had done. He built an army that never went home. His own inscriptions boast of 5,400 soldiers who ate their bread before him every single day. Not farmers called up for a season, but a standing force, paid by him, loyal to him, ready to march the hour he pointed. One man stood in his way. A short while before, a king of Uruk named Lugal-zage-si had done what no Sumerian had managed, and gathered most of the quarreling south under a single hand. If anyone was going to rule Sumer, by rights it should have been him. Sargon met him in battle and broke him. Then he did something the land would remember for 1,000 years. He clamped a wooden collar around the neck of the man who would have been its king, and marched him like a beast through the great gate of the god Enlil at Nippur, in front of every priest and every pilgrim who had come to worship there. It was carved into stone for the gods themselves to read. The land between the rivers had a new master, and he pointed at everyone. City after city fell. Uruk, whose walls were already legend, thrown down. Lagash, the proud old kingdoms of the south, brought to heel one by one. When the fighting was finished, Sargon ruled from the lower sea to the upper sea, from the Persian Gulf in the south to the shore of the Mediterranean in the north. For the first time anywhere on earth, dozens of cities, dozens of peoples, dozens of gods answered to a single throne. Sargon had not invented the city. The Sumerians did that. What Sargon invented was the empire itself. The idea that the world could be ruled from one place, by one man, under one name. Every empire that has risen since, from Rome to the powers of the present day, is standing on the shoulders of a Bronze Age cupbearer from Kish. But an empire is not held together by armies alone. Sargon understood that a conquered city with a foreign king would always dream of the day it rebelled. So he reached for something stronger than a garrison. He reached for a god. And the person he chose to wield it was not a general, it was his daughter. Her name was Enheduanna. Sargon made her the high priestess of the moon god at the holiest office in the conquered south, and through her he wed Akkad's power to Sumer's faith. But Enheduanna did far more than serve. She composed hymns, prayers, poems to the gods in the old Sumerian tongue, and somewhere in the middle of them she did something no human being is known to have done before her. She wrote down her own name. She said, in effect, "These are my words." Enheduanna is the first author in all of human history known to us by name. Not the first king, not the first god, the first named voice. 1700 years before Homer, the earliest writer whose name survives was a woman, and she was the daughter of the man who had just invented the empire she was helping to hold together. And then history did to Enheduanna what it does to almost anyone who stands near a throne. A rebel seized and demanded that the high priestess bless his claim to it. She refused. She was Sargon's daughter, and she would not lay her hands on a usurper. So he drove her from the temple and out through the city gates into exile. Stripped of her office and her home, Enheduanna reached for the one weapon still left to her. She wrote. In a long and furious and frightened poem, she named the man who had cast her out, and she begged her goddess to set it right. That poem is called The Exaltation of Inanna, and it is the oldest signed poem in the world. The first author known to history was not writing to flatter a king. She was writing to save her own life. And it worked. The revolt was put down, and Enheduanna walked back into her temple at The empire outlived its founder. It passed to Sargon's sons, and then to his grandson, and under that grandson it reached its height. His name was Naram-Sin. Early in his reign, the empire tried to throw him off. Cities rose together, north and south at the same moment, a rebellion so wide the Akkadians remembered it simply as the Great Revolt. A lesser king would have drowned in it. Naram-Sin, by his own account, won 9 battles in a single year and dragged the kings who had risen against him back to Akkad in chains. To his people, that did not look like the work of a man. It looked like the work of a god. And so, the inscriptions tell us, the citizens of Akkad came to their king and asked him to become the god of their city. He accepted. Not the servant of the gods, not the chosen of the gods. Naram-Sin, god of Akkad. On a great stone he had himself carved climbing a mountain over the bodies of his enemies, taller than every man around him, crowned with the horns that until that day only a god was allowed to wear. The empire had begun with a servant pretending to be a king. It had now reached a king pretending to be a god, and in the stories the Sumerians told afterward, that is the exact moment the gods stopped listening, because something was turning against Akkad that no army could fight. Around the year 2200 BC, the rains began to fail. Modern scientists have found its fingerprint deep in the mud of ancient lakebeds and seafloors, a drought so long and so severe it carries its own name, the 4.2 kilo-year event. For roughly a century, the sky over Mesopotamia dried out. The northern plains that grew the empire's grain hardened into dust. The farmers who worked them left their villages and fled south, crowding into cities that had no way to feed them. The Curse of Agade, a poem the Sumerians wrote afterward, records it without mercy. For the first time since cities were built, it says, the great fields grew no grain, the flooded fields grew no fish, the watered gardens grew no honey and no wine. A starving empire is a weak one. And down out of the Zagros mountains to the east came a people the Akkadians called barely human, the Gutians. They fell on the broken state, shattered its army, and took its cities. The Sumerians did not blame the weather. They blamed Naram-Sin. In their telling, the god-king had gone too far, had raised his hand against the temple of the great god Enlil. And Enlil had answered by calling down the mountain men and the ruin of everything Akkad had made. Myth, or the memory of a real catastrophe dressed as a myth? Perhaps both. Within a few generations, the first empire was simply gone. And here is the strangest part of the whole story. Its capital, the city of Akkad, the Agade that gave the empire its very name, the richest city in the world of its day, has never been found. Archaeologists have hunted for it for more than a century. Somewhere beneath the plains of Iraq, it is still waiting. The beating heart of the First Empire is the one piece of it the world has completely lost. There is one last ghost the First Empire left behind. The great port where Enheduanna once served the moon, sat on the very edge of the Persian Gulf. Ships tied up at its wharves. The sea was its front door. Today the ruins of lie 200 kilometers from open water. For 4,000 years the two rivers have carried their silt down to the coast and pushed the sea back, mile after mile, until a seaport became a desert. The First Empire has been gone so long that its cities are buried, its language is dead, its capital is lost, and even the sea it once sailed has drawn back beyond the horizon. It began with a single servant and a single idea, that the whole world could answer to one throne. That idea did not die in the dust of Akkad, but the man who tasted the wine had done what he set out to do. In the end, he had made himself the true king after all. If the rise and fall of the very first empire held you, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which empire should we raise from the dust next.